I'm back on the road, thanks to a federal rest requirement break from my job as a UP conductor in Eugene, and headed to the northeast corner of Oregon for Part 2, bringing you coverage of the La Grande Sub over the Blue Mountains. There's a lot of action and drama ahead for us, so let's enjoy the journey and see what Union Pacific has in store. Pendleton is where we stamp our ticket first, about 29 miles from the start at Hinkle. Let her buck is the roundup slogan at America's largest rodeo, and during the event it'll swell the population from 17 to 50,000 people. And just a few bullhorns south of Happy Canyon, the Union Pacific kicks up its own dust near milepole 214.7. A short Ogden to Portland freight is about to knock down the clear signal at CPN 215 at the west end of Pendleton Siding. As seen by the map, Pendleton represents the major population center of this corner of the state. A correction I must make is the pronunciation for what I called Rieth, which is actually said as Reeth, and the east switch of Reeth is right ahead of this unit train crossing one of the many bridges over the Umatilla River. I don't know why these CPKC motors found their way onto a train not headed to Eastport, Idaho. Foreign power tends to be rare on the La Grande Sub. A very nice museum sits inside the old Pendleton Depot next to the main line. It's worth a visit, with quality displays inside the beautifully restored building. Pendleton was a junction for two branch lines going north. One, Northern Pacific branch, later Burlington Northern, went to Wallula, and the other, Union Pacific, went to Walla Walla. The Burlington Northern abandoned its branch in 1991, removing the rails the following year. Shortly before that, UP abandoned its Walla Walla branch, donating some of the rail to the Sumter Valley Railroad. In the background, a highly visible shipper remains active. That despite a destructive fire in 2022 that caused damage to the flour mill. United Grain Corp bought the property after repairs were made, and today, hoppers are still spotted for loading. A small yard devoid of cars sits astride the old depot this hot July day, while a PSR combination of trains passes me by. The train name OT4WV reflects the unit hoppers of soda ash returning to West Vaco, Wyoming, where the cars will be refilled and returned to Terminal 4 in Portland. However, the head end of the train has been invaded by several loose freight cars, followed by a long string of autoracks, which will be set off at some point before Wyoming. Though long, this train is light, a rare conventional train that doesn't require DPUs. West Vaco's huge soda ash mine between Bryan and Granger in western Wyoming will send and receive 1 or 2 100-plus car unit trains daily. They will spend right about 48 hours per journey between the mine and Terminal 4 in northwest Portland. Pendleton's siding, at 7,640 feet, picks up right where Reef ends, only separated by the bridge crossing the Umatilla River. Though long, this controlled siding isn't of much use to the dispatcher for train meets because of the 7 busy road crossings therein. A sided train here could shut down Pendleton unless the meet was a slider, 2 trains passing each other without stopping. Still following the Umatilla, the grade is increased to 1% and holds there for roughly 15 miles. Just beyond Homely, I'm once again looking up at a steel bridge with a date of 1920. These silver bridges, all built and placed about at the same time, have been earning their keep for over a century. Now we see a heavy soda ash unit train from Wyoming, headed for Terminal 4 in Portland. These are the heaviest trains the route sees, with nearly 20,000 tons in tow. As we hear the dynamic brakes from the mid-train set of helpers, it's interesting to think that for more than 3/4 of this trip, the engineer only needs braking to move the train, as it will be traveling downhill from the summit at KAMELA all the way to Hinkle, save for a small rise at Stanfield. Several miles past Homely, our first double-main track since leaving Hinkle splits at Meacham and comes back together at Gibbon, where we are currently. There was a Y near Gibbon, where manned helpers used to turn before taking on the grueling 2% grade ahead. The tracks have been paved over, however, a victim of the DPU technology, eliminating the need for these outposts. This train is headed to Portland's Albina Yard from Ogden, Utah. Both yards are flat switching yards. System-wide, UP operates 11 hump yards. Hinkle was UP's premier Northwest yard until the hump was downgraded recently under the direction of Jim Vinna, the current Chief Operating Officer. To the right is a 1,256-foot set-out track off of Main Track 2 here at Gibbon, listed in the timetable along with 8 others in the subdivision. The double track here is a mere 4.2 miles long, and UP 3053 here will be meeting an eastbound stack train. What is unknown is why the train needed to stop before getting between switches. The pause was a brief one, however, and soon enough the consist was moving up to control point N233 at Meacham. The signal at Gibbon goes green, and whoever was assembling these trains over the blues must have known I'd want the cleanest locomotives up front for the camera, so I thank them. A train of containers stacked and packed on a 2,400-mile route. It's hard to tell much difference between this I train from Tacoma from any Z train also heading to Chicago. An I train and a Z train are essentially the same thing, right? So what's really the difference in that one letter? Everything. Though both are technically intermodal trains, that Z means priority. Priority, as the dispatcher in Omaha is at his board making decisions on who to side and who to send. Also, priority for scheduling pickups and setouts. An ITAG-4 will make setouts and pickups at North Platte and Global 3 before terminating at Global 4. Of course, the Z trains will also stop at North Platte, but only to set out cars, keeping its 2.5-day schedule alive. This I train, though, on the same yellow brick road to Chicago, has a 5-day schedule between Tacoma and Global 4. Only a few feet after leaving Gibbon, the tracks make a hard right turn as we see the last car disappear behind the trees. It's here the line leaves the Umatilla River and cuts into the hills following Meacham Creek, which it will follow most of the way to the top of the grade. Thick outpourings of hot lava now sit stone cold. Today, the only hot thing flowing through here is the Z train. The Silver Bridge betrays the location of the first crossing of Meacham Creek shortly before the controlled siding of Bonifer. As the rails strike compass south into the blues, the grade, though not yet showing its full teeth, is beginning to increase from 1% at Milam to 1.27% at Bonifer. For the model railroaders, a simple project that could greatly increase the realism of your layout would be to add a slide fence like this one between your track and a rock wall. If an errant rock breaks even one of the wires, it will cause the signals to go red as if a track occupancy had occurred, causing trains to proceed with caution and avoid potential derailments. It's all high greens today, though, for this stack train. Another I train, another 5-day scheduled trip between Global 4 and Seattle, with stops at North Platte and Fife Yard near Tacoma for setouts and pickups. I'm going to move ahead while the tracks wind up the canyon. I'm driving up Immigrant Road, another route up the mountains, with great views over the farmlands below, and the I-84 lanes winding up the surprisingly steep slope of the unsuspectingly challenging Blues, which today don't look like much, but in actuality, the rails must rise about a vertical half a mile from where we left them at Bonifer to reach a summit of about 4,200 feet of elevation. Possibly my favorite moment came here at High Bridge, watching and listening to this train clawing east up the 2% grade, led by another spotless locomotive. As the train passes, it becomes clear that it is picking up speed. From here on to High Bridge, the west slope reaches 2%, its steepest grade, but from here to about Ross, the grade drops to 0.4%, offering struggling engines a reprieve. When it first came into view, it was down to 12 miles per hour. The break is a short one though, as it picks right back up to 2% for the last few miles to KAMELA. We're not only in the steepest grades now, but the longest area of double main track on the subdivision, which extends 9 miles from Highbridge to Nordine. Meacham Creek is full of spring snowmelt, treading sides of the canyon with the tracks a few times around Highbridge. The final reminders of the long winter cling to the shadows here, around 3,500 feet of elevation, about 700 feet in elevation lower than the summit. With dynamic brakes doing all the work, a half-empty intermodal train glides down Main Track 2. More and more braking gets utilized as more of the train comes off the light grade onto the heavy. It's here that the line breaks away from following a waterway for the first time since Hinkle. It's at these signals many trains will pause when meeting trains. It's a good place to stop while still on easy grade and not following the crossing of Meacham's Main Street, a place perhaps of more historical significance than you'd expect. In July 1923, President Warren G. Harding gave a moving address from the back of his Pullman car right here. Celebrating the 80th anniversary since the covered wagon migration, Meacham was named Capital of the U.S. for a day. Meacham is a rare outpost of civilization on the hill, with some residences and a store that also serves food at the Oregon Trail Store and Deli. President Harding closed his speech with these words here. There are no new worlds to conquer. Gone is the last frontier, and the steady grind of the wagon train of the sturdy pioneer. But their memories live like a thing divine, treasured in heaven above, for the trail that led to the storied West was the wonderful Trail of Love. The accomplishments of those sturdy pioneers which settled and prospered Oregon, celebrated then 80 years hence, are now a 182-year distant memory, hopefully never forgotten. By far the longest set-out track on the sub is here, on the right, measuring in at 3,265 feet in length. On Main Track 2, an intermodal train is easing to the end of 0.4% grade to Meacham eastbound at Meacham. We're finally standing at the top, a short-lived plateau atop the Blues at 4,200 feet that refuses to allow any train crew to relax, as almost immediately, as these signs warn, even steeper grades await on the east slope. Here's a profile illustrating the grade from Camp to La Grande, roughly the east 35 miles of the La Grande Sub. A detector near Nordine is announcing a westbound arrival, but the prime movers are already audible above the trees. More than 2,000 miles these containers of goods will be ushered along by Union Pacific between Chicago and Portland, and this short section of track is the greatest challenge the train will face in all that distance. The days of oxen and wooden wheels may be done, but the uphill struggle is still not overcome easily, even with steel rail and 4,300 horsepower locomotives. Broken knuckles scattered along an area dubbed Drawbar Alley evidence past hardships. A failed knuckle is a far easier fix than a failed drawbar, however, as any experienced railroader will say. Managing in-train buff forces while half your train is on an uphill 2% grade and half is on a downhill 2% grade is a skill known to only a handful of hogheads.
approach, N270 out.
Control point N270 is where the siding begins at KAMELA. The center track offers a 1.6-mile long siding for even more options for the dispatcher to alleviate bottlenecks. Just ahead, the siding in Main Track 2 end, and no sooner does this empty potash train stop, but a Pocatello to Hinkle manifest arrives.
Dash 3, P8861, over.
Cresting the grade, the dynamics kick in on the Duke, sounding like a steam train whistle. With only 2 locomotives handling the 126 cars down the 2.21% grade, this empty unit train will certainly be supplementing the dynamic brakes with air brakes. And that will conclude part 2. But stay tuned, friends, because Pacific Rail Productions is far from done. Enjoy this look ahead at part 3 of Union Pacific's La Grande Subdivision, when we will see views of the dramatic east end of the Blues. Thanks once again, friends, for watching and riding along with Pacific Rail Productions.